Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. People are still coming in from the waiting room, so we're going to get started in a minute. Okay. Everyone should be on Zoom. On mute. We're all on Zoom, obviously. If you, by some chance, are not on mute, please put yourself on mute. So I want to say welcome to everyone. I'm Julie Zuckerman, the author of Book of Jeremiah. And I'm excited to welcome you to the May Literary Modiin author event. Before I introduce today's authors, I'm going to take a minute to tell you about Literary Modiin. I know some of you have heard my whole spiel before, but for many of you, it's your first time here, so welcome. For those who aren't familiar, Modiin is a planned city in Israel, about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's very close to the airport, which is now open for tourists, even though you have to do a corona test when you get here. So please come and visit the next time you're in Israel. And for those of you who are watching from Israel, I know that there's some big announcements going on right now about our potential next government. So thank you for being here with us in the literary world, which is where I prefer to be. Anyway, we have a large population of English speakers in Modiin. So in June 2019, right after my book came out, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers here. We held several in-person events, and when the pandemic hit, we switched to virtual format, which allows us to hear from authors and to welcome attendees from all over the world. We're really going back to normal here in Israel, but I love the online format and hosting more people. So for now, keeping this all virtual and online. I'm going to share my screen for a second, so you can. I just want to show you all of the books of authors that we've hosted. So, okay, you can see my screen. So you see our three authors for today at the top, and kind of goes mostly in backwards chronological order. But I encourage you to check out all of these books. And I know that some of our previous speakers are here with us tonight. So I want to say welcome to Ariel Mazes and Lisa Bordetsky-Williams and Meryl Ain, Joanna Hain, Lori Vanoff-Kaufman, Janice Weitzman, and I hope I didn't miss anyone. Anyway, so please check out their books as well. And tomorrow I'm going to send out this whole, a link to this so you can get it. Okay. The format of today's event is that each author will be speaking for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have a large attendance, so everyone's on mute, as I said, and you can put your questions in the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties, send a private note in the chat to me. We're also broadcasting this live on Facebook in Literary Modiin, so feel free to start a watch party. Okay, now I will introduce our first author, Meryl Ain. Meryl's articles and essays have appeared in the Huffington Post, the New York Jewish Week, the New York Times, Newsday, and other publications. In 2014, she co-authored the award-winning book, The Living Memories Project, Legacies That Last, and in 2016 wrote a companion workbook, My Living Memories Project Journal. She is a sought-after speaker and has been interviewed on television, radio, and podcasts. She's a career educator and is proud to be both a teacher and student of history. She has also worked as a school administrator. So Meryl, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Julie, for inviting me and for arranging this program. It's a pleasure to be here with Karen and Menachem. Although I've done many Zooms since The Takeaway Men was published last August, this is my first event in Israel, and I'm honored to be here. The Takeaway Men is my debut novel. The vast majority of my published writing has been nonfiction, but I wanted to write a post-Holocaust book, not a Holocaust one. And I thought that this particular story could best be told in a novel. I learned that Holocaust novels are actually the best-selling category on Amazon. But I wanted to write about the lesser-known story of what happened to the survivors and their children after the war was over. Unable or unwilling to return to their homes in Europe, they left and had to start new lives in countries where they did not speak the language nor understand the culture and may have experienced prejudice and discrimination. In addition, they had just been subject to the most horrific cruelty and trauma in human history. At the time, there was no term PTSD nor support services to deal with emotional and psychological issues. By the way, the term Holocaust, as well as the word survivor, had not yet come into use. What we now call survivors were referred to as refugees or greeners. The Takeaway Men is about fraternal twins, Branka and Jojo Lubinsky, and their parents, who come to the US from a DP camp in the years after World War II. As new immigrants, they experience the difficulties of adjusting to American culture, as well as the burgeoning fear of the Cold War. As the girls get older, they start to wonder about their parents' past, and they begin to demand answers. My cast of characters represents many different aspects of this topic. In addition to survivors and children of survivors, there's a righteous Gentile, a former Nazi, and a victim of the Red Scare in the 50s. As an educator, I've taught about the Holocaust, researched and read about it, and planned programs. As a child, I heard the word concentration camp, I believe, accidentally slipped from my mother's tongue. My parents tried to shield us from everything unpleasant, but we lived in a small house and I had very big ears. I asked my mother, what is a concentration camp? And eventually she gave me a copy of the Diary of Anne Frank to read when I was in the 6th grade. I immediately identified with Anne, but when I finished, I wanted to know what happened to her and her family after the book ended. And I guess I've been seeking answers ever since. Later, I became friends with survivors and their children. I was drawn to them and their stories. As a journalist, I interviewed survivors and covered events. One of the great inspirations of my life and of the Takeaway Men have been my dear friends who were and are survivors, spouses of survivors, and children and grandchildren of survivors. I read, researched, interviewed, and spoke to survivors and 2 and 3Gs, and found that while there was a common denominator in that the Holocaust impacted all of them, their reactions to it varied widely. Some survivors spoke about it, many did not. Some children embraced their parents' legacy, while others rebelled against it. And I felt a visceral connection to these survivors and their families, even though my own parents were both born in the United States and actually served in the US Army during World War II. So because I have no known familial connection, I felt a great responsibility to be accurate in this work of fiction. So I wanted to make sure that all the background facts were 100% accurate. I did meticulous research about every aspect of this topic. And I firmly believe that if you are going to portray the Shoah in fiction or in nonfiction or in film, or in a Netflix series, or in any other medium for that matter, you must be correct and precise about what actually happened. The survivors and their families inspired and encouraged me throughout my book journey, and I'm so gratified that they told me that I got their story right. Another device I chose to get the story correct was to craft my 2 main characters Jojo and Branka as twins so I could explore the range of reactions and behaviors of children of survivors. Jojo wants to be a popular American girl and is even embarrassed by her father's Yiddish accent. Branka is sensitive, anxious, and fearful, and even wishes she could heal her father from his sadness. As I learned from my friends, neither survivors nor their children can be painted with one brush stroke. I wanted to focus on the complexity of the experience. So there's Aaron, who refuses to talk about his past, and his friend and fellow survivor, Jacob, who can't stop talking about it. The difference shows up again in Hebrew school, where the principal reprimands Mrs. Cohn for teaching the children about the Shoah. Speaking of the principal in my book and the Hebrew school teacher, I'd like to mention that attitudes about Holocaust education in the United States have changed markedly since the 1950s. Americans, including many Jews, did not want to focus on the past during this time period. Much has changed, but there are still only 17 out of 50 states in the United States that mandate Holocaust education. And unfortunately, a nationwide survey released in September 2020 indicated that there was an appalling lack of basic Holocaust information among American adults under 40, including more than 1 in 10 respondents who claimed they had never heard the word Holocaust before. The survey, which was commissioned by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, was the first 50-state survey of Holocaust knowledge among millennials and Generation Z. 63% of those surveys did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Well, there were more than 40,000 concentration camps and ghettos established during World War II. About half of those polled were unable to name a single one. So as we continue to lose survivors, and studies show that many young people are unfamiliar with the Holocaust, it's more important than ever to inform them about what happened. So I'm really very pleased that the Takeaway Men is being recommended for teenagers as well as adults. In the Takeaway Men, it was also very important to me to portray in detail the setting and attitudes of the post-war era. The Lubinskys come to America in 1951 at a time that on one hand appeared to be booming and optimistic, and on the other hand had a very dark underbelly to it. GIs were coming home from the war, they were going back to school on the GI Bill of Rights, or they were getting married, starting families, buying homes. There were new industries booming, such as plastics and deodorants, and of course, the new medium of black and white TV was in increasingly more living rooms. But there was also the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war, the Red Scare, the McCarthy hearings, and the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Not to mention Nazis. I found in my research that some of them had been invited by the US government, and they were actually hiding in plain sight. In fact, the United States government invited about 1,500 former Nazis to come to the United States after the war to work in the space program, the nuclear program at Los Alamos, and to track down communist spies. The Lubinsky family, carrying the baggage of their years of trauma and dislocation, had to navigate an unfamiliar terrain and language. The twins went to school and played inventive games with their friends, but because of the nuclear threat from the Russians, they also had to participate in take cover drills in kindergarten, where they crouched under their desks and they heard things, even if their parents made a great effort to hide everything from them. In the Takeaway Men, I wanted to explore the impact of immigration, Jewish identity, prejudice, secrets, and lies on parents and children. I wanted to raise important questions in the book that are both specific to that time period, but are also timely and timeless. So some of these questions include, how did this happen? What is our responsibility to our fellow human beings? What do we do when we see evil in the world? Do we speak, take action, join in, or look away? How do we treat those who are different, including immigrants? One of my favorites, who is a Jew? What is the impact of secrets and lies on families and children, and those who are perpetuating those secrets and lies? Before I conclude, I'd like to tell you about International Holocaust Survivor Day, which is a new observance that was conceived by Jonathan Ornstein, director of the Jewish Community Center in Krakow, along with Michael Berenbaum, former director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm so honored to serve on the International Advisory Committee for this observance. The inaugural celebration will take place on June 24th, with June 26th designated as Survivor Shabbat. Communities and organizations throughout the world will pause and honor the ever-dwindling numbers of those who endured and persevered. And it will also be a time to remember those survivors who still struggle today on the fringe, poor and alone, and to offer them renewed assistance. There are only about 300,000 survivors alive today, most of whom are in Israel. In addition to programs throughout the world, a kickoff event in Israel organized by Ambassador Colette Avital, who is also a member of the advisory committee, will take place at the Habima National Theater on June 24th. I'd like to conclude with a very short excerpt which encapsulates the impact of the Holocaust on both the adult survivor and his child. During the night, Branka hears her father, Aaron, screaming and runs into her parents' bedroom. As she tries to calm her father, her mother, Judy, attempts to soothe her. Aaron slept fitfully that night. He kept Judy awake with his crying and moaning. In his nightmares, he was transported back to April 1941 in Kels, where his family had been eating a sumptuous Sabbath meal served by Judy dressed in white. Suddenly, there were screeches which reached a peak when he and his bride and his parents, grandparents, sisters, and brothers, along with his in-laws, were rounded up and herded into the ghetto. At about 6 o'clock, while Jojo slept, Branka was awakened by her father's screams. Frightened and upset, she grabbed her teddy bear and went into her parents' bedroom. Mama, Mama, why is Papa crying? He had a bad dream. I brought him my teddy. Branka, leave now. Aaron snapped at the child, suddenly awake and embarrassed that his little daughter had seen and heard him. But I brought you Teddy to make you feel better. Branka, dear, Judy said, Papa is very sad and he needs to be alone now. But you are here with him. I just wanted to give him Teddy, she said as her eyes began to well up with tears. Branka, gehe weg, he yelled in Yiddish. She bolted out of the room, sobbing hysterically, and crawled into Jojo's bed, clutching her teddy bear. Jojo, who had been awakened by the yelling, put her arms around her twin. I don't like it when Papa yells at me and tells me to go away, Branka sniffled. I like it when he smiles at me and gives me a cookie in the bakery. I don't like it when you are sad. That makes me sad too, said Jojo. I don't like it when Papa cries. It's scary, said Branka. Mama is happy, said Jojo. Mama can make Papa feel better, said Bronca. Bronca's tears soon turned into giggles as Jojo began tickling her. It was on her second morning in Belrose that Bronca decided that she would try harder to make her father happy. She would be like Mama. Thank you.
Thank you, Meryl. That was great. That was great. Now I'd like to introduce our next author. Karen Marron lives and writes in Tel Aviv. Her fiction chapbook, Bass 1998, was published in 2020 by Goldline Press. She is a creative nonfiction editor and the production editor of the Ilanot Review, and is an alumnus of Bar-Ilan University's graduate program in creative writing. So Karen, please take it away. And
thanks, Julie. And hi, everyone. And first of all, Julie, thank you so much for having us here and for just creating this beautiful community and basically putting Modiin on the literary map. And Meryl and Menachem, it's really great to be reading here with you tonight. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my chapbook, Bass 1998, B-A-S-S 1998. And first of all, I should probably say what a chapbook is, because it's a format that's a little more common in poetry and in fiction, not so much. So a chapbook is literally just a very, very short book. And my book is 39 pages long, and it contains 20 very, very short stories. So the title, Bass 1998, is an abbreviation of Best American Short Stories, 1998. And the basic idea of my book is that it's a reinterpretation, or you could say a misinterpretation of the Best American Short Stories anthology series. And some of you might be familiar with the series. It's a yearly anthology of the 20 best short stories published in North America in the previous year. And those stories are selected by a guest editor, who's usually a famous writer. And many writers at one time or another dream of having their stories selected for the anthology. And at least that was one of my dreams when I first started writing semi-seriously. And well, the dream hasn't come true yet. So as one does, at some point I started to think, that dream sucks anyway, because, when you think about it, it just sets you up for disappointment, even if it comes true, because the whole concept of a yearly dated anthology that comes out every year kind of means that your success has an expiration date. So it's like, sure, your story was picked last year, but what have you done this year? And if your story was picked 10 years ago and you haven't done anything since, then, forget about it. You might as well give up. So some of the writers in the Best American Short Stories are famous writers who get stories selected every year or every few years. But for many writers, the story they have published in the anthology is really their only claim to fame, and then they just kind of disappear. So my chapbook, Bass 1998, is it's kind of a protest against that disappearance and that irrelevance. And it takes a specific, a kind of random year, the year 1998, which theoretically none of us should care about anymore. And it's saying to these stories, you're still here. Someone is still thinking about you. You still matter. And the process of writing this book was basically, I read each of the stories in the original Best American Short Stories 1998 again and again and again and again. And I tried to find some way to connect with each one of them and to create a story of my own that related to each one in some way. So what ended up coming out is a short chapbook with a format that's exactly the same as the format of the Best American Short Stories 1998 anthology. So each story has the same title as one of the stories in the book, and it has a connection to the story. So some of my stories explicitly talk about the original story in Best American Short Stories. And for some of the stories, I actually researched the writers themselves and kind of stalked them. And my own stories were inspired by what I found out. And I'm sure if those authors ever read my chapbook, they will really appreciate what I've done. And some of the stories are just my own personal stories that relate to a theme and the original story that resonated with me. But the thing is, to an outside reader, they might not seem to relate to the best American short stories at all. And that's also part of my idea, that in trying to hold on to this dated book, this book that's supposed to kind of be a product of its time, and really overworking it and focusing on it way, way too much, then you also just make it completely fall apart. And I don't know if it comes across on Zoom, but this is my volume of the original Best American Short Stories, and it's a mess. It's held together with tape, and it's very sad. So what's left is just a ghost of what it was before. So now I'm going to read you one of the stories in my collection, and it's called People Like That Are the Only People Here. And this story is in conversation with the story by the same name, by Lori Moore. And the original story talks about a child being treated in a hospital for a very serious disease. And in that story, one of the characters mentions what she calls collateral beauty. It's the beautiful things about people that are revealed in really horrible situations. And the narrator of the story, who's the child's mother, she doesn't really buy that idea. But still, the idea of collateral beauty spoke to me. And my story also talks about that kind of beauty. So I'll read it to you now. People like that are the only people here. At parties, when the plastic surgeon tells people what he does, they always jump to conclusions. Nose jobs, boob jobs, rich people who only care about their appearance, self-centered, narcissistic. They don't say it, but he knows that's what they're thinking. So he reminds them why his profession is honorable. Reconstructive surgery, burn victims, mastectomies. And the people at the parties say, I didn't think about that. Well, come on, let's be honest. The guy has floppy hair. He reviews wine on social media. When my daughter burned her hand, it wasn't in the middle of chaos or anger or disaster, just the general annoyance of dinner time. This thing that happens every night, and despite happening every night, still takes us by surprise. What will we eat? We had nothing in the house, and no one wanted to go to the store. It was too cold. So we made tomato soup out of a powder, with some wilting vegetables thrown in to seem like we'd made an effort. I wasn't watching my daughter, just learning to stand. I was focused on my food, on my annoyance, on finishing it, on finishing the day so I could be free, or actually free to work, free to complete tasks. She put her hand on the radiator and pushed herself up. And I thought, the radiator is not so hot. Nothing to be concerned about. I frequently touch it myself to keep warm. Except it was so hot. And she stood there and began to realize and began to scream. And I jerked her away, and her hand made a sound of ripping flesh. I will never let myself go, some people say. She let herself go. After the baby, she let herself go. That means getting fat. That means wearing clothes that aren't nice. That means inadequate skin care, inadequate hair care. It means that people who see you will not want to have sex with you ever. But it doesn't matter anyway, because you're not available for such things. I want a plastic surgeon to look at this, says the senior physician in the pediatric unit. I nod gamely. I have been game. 3 doctors have checked my daughter's hand, but none knew what he was doing. They were all students learning the skill of writing things down on a sheet of paper. One said 1st degree, one said 2nd degree, no 3rd degree yet. If I am game, then she will be okay. If I do everything that is required of me as a parent, then my child will not be hurt. But so much is required. At all times, so many actions must be taken. I wait for the plastic surgeon for a long time. Dr. Daniel is what they call him. She'll be fine, he says. He smiles at her, says she's cute. There is a bad smell in this room, he says. Let's step out. We don't have to stay in this room with a bad smell. It would never have occurred to me to step out of a room with a bad smell in it. I immediately assume that the bad smell is my fault. The plastic surgeon does not make that assumption. It is so easy to let yourself go. To keep it from happening, you have to spend your whole life holding on to yourself. You would think that if you let yourself go, you would float away, untethered. But people who let themselves go have no fear of this, because so much binds them to the ground. So much they could not rise an inch above it, even if they wanted to do that more than anything in the world. The plastic surgeon kept telling me to come back. A week from now, 10 days from now, 2 weeks from now, so he could see how the burns were healing. I replaced the bandage twice a day, applying the cream that prevents infection or the cream that reduces inflammation, winding the gauze between those tiny fingers and keeping it shut. Twice a day, the way I'm supposed to brush your teeth, though, let's be honest, I usually skip one because I don't have the energy to fight. This time, though, I did not skip a single one. After it healed, the doctor seemed proud of my achievement and said, "You need to oil the hand every day for 6 weeks with baby oil, and that way there will be no scars." The fact that it was so obvious to him that this was something that mattered, the way the flesh on the inside of a hand looked, that changed everything for me. Though maybe it changed nothing, because I stopped oiling after a week. Still, there are no scars. Thank you very much.
That's great. As I was reading Bass 1998, I was like, oh, I love this story. And then I'd read the next one. Oh, I love this one even more. So everybody should get a copy. I will introduce our next speaker. Menachem Kaiser is a writer currently living in, hold on, I'm placing the pin here. Currently living in Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in Toronto, Canada. He has a BA from Columbia and an MFA from the University of Michigan, which, by the way, I didn't tell you this before, but those are our two schools, me and my husband, so yay. Menachem was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, BOM, Vogue, and elsewhere. So thank you, Menachem, and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Julie, for organizing. Nice to meet you, Karen and Meryl. It's really nice to read and talk with you guys. So my memoir, Plunder, came out just about 3 months ago. It's interesting, in contrast with Meryl, I'd actually set out to write fiction, and it became sort of against my will nonfiction. And so to tell you briefly about the book, basically follows two parallel storylines. One is my ongoing attempt to reclaim property that belonged to my great-grandfather in Poland. And to give you some context, so I did not know my grandfather growing up. He died 8 years before I was born. It's my father's father's, and I'm named after him, so we have identical names. But beyond not knowing him, I also didn't really know that much about him, particularly his wartime legacy. So that was something that never really got passed down. He died when my father was in his mid-20s and hadn't really spoken about what had happened to him during the war. So that story was mostly lost. I'll say as an aside, and my parents are actually here, hi mom and dad, one of the really sort of interesting and moving effects of having published the book is that it has reignited a conversation in my family about my grandparents' legacy. And so in various interviews that I've had over the last few months, a question that got asked a number of times was, if you could say something to your grandfather, what would you say? And I always sort of stumbled on that question because I found it to be kind of an awkward question, and I don't know. And then my father took the opportunity to sort of reframe the question and say, what would your grandfather say to you? And he wrote like a really moving 4-page response that he distributed to the family. And so that's been sort of a special treat of the book, sort of within the family, of sort of reintroducing the legacy and the story and reigniting that conversation. Back to the contents of the book. So yeah, trying to reclaim the property in Poland. And as you know, it presents some legal and some moral hurdles. Legally speaking, I thought it would be a pretty straightforward process. You know, the property had belonged to my family before the war. It basically still was technically owned by my family. But that turned out to be very, very tricky. Primarily, the main hurdle that I was facing was proving to the courts that my relatives who had died in the Holocaust were in fact dead. And you know, and slash my great grandparents would be nearly 140 years old. So sort of establishing the deaths within the court system would seem to be something, you know, relatively straightforward. That turned out not to be the case. And so, you know, I lost in the first round, I lost the appeal. And so it sort of set me down like a kind of surreal sort of, you know, the term that gets bandied around out is, you know, Kafka-esque court system, trying to figure out what's what. You know, so one of the hallmarks of the book is that I'm very open about my mistakes and my errors and my mishaps and what I misunderstand. And you know, part of that, it was on me. So part of the legal process was I wasn't prepared. My lawyers made errors. The judicial system was, you know, had questionable independence. And so, you know, that's part of the storyline is me moving through that, but also interrogating what I know and my own motivations throughout. The second part of the story is a little bit stranger. It's me falling down a rabbit hole of treasure hunters. The story's a little bit long. We don't have that much time, but the short version is that there is a community of treasure hunters based mostly in Southwest Poland in the province called Silesia. And these guys, treasure hunters is a little bit of a misnomer, but it basically includes, it's a very large community, by most counts over 100,000 people. And this includes guys with who go out with metal detectors on weekends. It also includes some, you know, very sophisticated, sometimes even sponsored expedition groups using high-end equipment. And at the center of this treasure hunter culture is something called Project Riza, which is a series of 7 underground complexes built using mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. And they're, you know, tunnels or underground complexes are vast, at least the ones closest to completion. And so we're talking like square kilometers or, you know, ceilings that are 20 meters tall. You know, the plans, as far as we can tell, were to hollow out a mountain. So it is an infrastructure project that's truly mind-boggling. But what makes them truly enigmatic is that the fact that they have virtually no primary German documentation. So from a historical perspective, there's really a dearth of evidence. And so because of that, you know, lack of primary documentation, they sort of occupied they've gained a mythological status within the treasure hunter community, attracting quite a bit of, let's call it, amateur historians, conspiracy theorists. It's just sort of one of the central features within that community. Now, I heard about these guys in 2015 when 2 of these so-called treasure hunters announced to the world that they had found a golden train. And the golden train is an ostensible legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that had been hidden inside of a mountain towards the end of the war. And 2 guys claimed that they had found it. And the world, for interesting reasons, which I try to tease out in the book, took it very, very seriously. And so for about 6-7 months in 2015, you had international media. So, you know, the New York Times, the New Yorker, BBC, the Discovery Channel, Time, all descended on this village of Wawrzech trying to investigate these guys' claims. I heard about it at the same time as everyone else. I was sort of tickled by the idea, really intrigued. Had nothing to do with my family as far as I knew. And I'd been spending quite a bit of time in Poland doing unrelated research. And at the time, I was doing my MFA in fiction writing at the University of Michigan. And I thought this would be really good fodder for a novel, really good set piece. So I reached out to a guide and said, hey, would you show me around for a couple of days, introduce me to some of the treasure hunters, take me to the tunnels? And she said, sure. And when I went, I met them. They took me to the tunnels. It kind of broke my brain. It was really, really overwhelming, really, really interesting. And then afterwards, we were just having a beer, kicking back. And I was asking them all these kind of softball questions about, what's your work? What do you guys find in the tunnels? Where'd you grow up? And then, but a friend of mine who is a lot more chutzpah than I do asked a much tougher question. She asked, you know, it's all very macho and everything. You guys are all very cool, but what about the fact that all these Jews died digging these tunnels? You know, because the tunnels are, you know, an engineering, something really to take in engineering wise, but they're also a site of mass death. About 14,000 Jews died as slave laborers working on the tunnels. And as soon as that question was asked, the treasure hunters got very animated, kind of defensive, and started speaking very rapidly in Polish, which I don't speak. So I was just sort of waiting patiently for it to be translated. But they were speaking very quickly, and it was quickly becoming a conversation that I was not part of. So the Polish was just sort of washing over me until I started hearing my last name. And the treasure hunter just didn't know my last name. And so they weren't referring to me. And I kept hearing sort of Kaiser, just like as little, in a weird, I don't know if you've ever heard your name in a language you don't speak, your ears sort of perk up. So eventually I got curious enough to interrupt them and asked why they kept saying my last name. And they said, "What do you mean? Abraham Kaiser. You don't know who that is?" I said no. And so they explained that Abraham Kaiser was a slave laborer who had kept a secret diary while in the camps that's, you know, provided slave labor to these tunnels. And he had written his notes on scraps of stolen cement packaging, which before he was transferred from camp to camp, nailed to the underside of the latrines. And after the war, he had gone from camp to camp retrieving these notes, brought them to an editor, and it was published in Poland in the early 60s. And this, you know, became a diary in Polish called Zarzutami Śmierci, which translates as Behind the Wires of Death. And this diary, owing to the lack of documentation, has become a kind of sacred text among the treasure hunter community. You know, subsequently, I would go on to meet treasure hunters who'd read the diary 40 times, or who'd follow the pilgrimage from camp to camp. And Abraham Kaiser had become a mythological figure in his own right, really kind of a celebrity among this community, and sort of like a very symbolic character. So I went back, I ended up buying the diary the next day at a gift shop outside one of the tunnels, really just as a souvenir. But then that night I Google translated the preface, and there was a sort of scholarly preface written by the museum. And I was able to piece together a family tree owing to the documents I had regarding the reclamation. And I discovered that not only was I related to Abraham Kaiser, but he was my grandfather's closest surviving relative. So we had always been under the impression that my grandfather's entire family had been wiped out. So his siblings and his parents, his grandparents, and his aunts, uncles, and cousins. But that night, sitting in a rented apartment in Warsaw, I found out that my family was not extinct, so to speak. And Abraham Kaiser was my grandfather's first cousin. And this sort of spread in the treasure hunter community. They realized who I was, that I was related to Abraham Kaiser, and they embraced me. And I became a celebrity in my own right among the treasure hunter community. So part of the book, follows that thread of my sort of descent down that rabbit hole and sort of figuring out what's going on within the treasure hunter community. And these two narrative threads, one of the reclamation, one of the treasure hunters, start overlapping and getting entangled in ways that surprised me even. So I'll say, just as a quick response, what Meryl said was really interesting to me, that she was sort of went out of her way. She felt that her story could be best told in a novel. I had been interested in writing this as fiction, but in a way, it got too strange and unwieldy for any novel that I could imagine. And the story, one of sort of the things that seems to both delight and frustrate readers is that there is a lack of resolution, not in a grand narrative sense, like whether or not I got the building back, but also in a sort of micro sense from chapter to chapter. The story sort of refused to behave. And I found that while writing the book to be a very frustrating experience. You set out to write a book and you expect the world to fall in line, but it just sort of never seems to go. And I kept getting delayed and frustrated, and the course didn't get back to me. And I sort of felt forced into writing it as a memoir because all I could do was sort of present my ambivalence, present the lack of resolution, and sort of like let the meaning sort of arise out of that. In a novel, I felt like that avenue had been closed off. I felt like if I had written as a novel, it would have had to make a lot more sense, presented a needed resolution. or, maybe a more talented writer than I could have sort of figured out a messy way to do that, but I didn't see any avenue forward. And so I'll do a short reading from the middle of the book. And this happens right after I find out that the building I had spent about 2 years researching and meeting the inhabitants and meeting the residents turned out to be the wrong building. And so the addresses were incorrect. I found that years into my research. And so basically I just sort of confront the nature of mistake in our legacies. Our origin stories are stories of where we come from, of where our parents and their parents and their parents come from, are riddled with errors. My grandmother's tombstone, to give a particularly blatant example, it's literally set in stone, says she was born in Oshvenshim, but that's wrong. She grew up there, was born in Rzeszów. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard about someone schlepping to Eastern Europe in order to trace their family story, to follow their memory map, only to discover that they'd had their entire lives a major or minor detail incorrect. The dates don't add up, the train routes are impossible, this address never existed, the ghetto had already been liquidated by then. It always feels surprising, bumping up against an error like this, but it shouldn't be. Family stories are poor preservers of history. They're fragmented, badly documented, warped by hearsay, conjecture, legend. Of course, errors are going to creep in. This seems somehow wrong, even blasphemous, at odds with the private sacredness we impute to our origin stories. But most stories in most families aren't meant or relied on as preservation of hard information. They're meant and relied on as preservation of soft information, a sentiment, narrative, identity of who someone was and subsequently who you are. It tells not a historical truth, but an emotional truth. I'd even argue that the built-in uncertainty, often unknowability, of details large and small is essential to the family mythos. We not only receive, but also participate in the story. On some level, we choose to believe. We ascribe. And the truth is that the details most easily corrupted are not details most people care all that much about anyway. What's the difference between number 12 and number 34 when either building is on a funny named street in a city you think about only in terms of dead Jews in a country your family fled from? The mistake of my grandmother's tombstone, I've been bringing it up for years, but no one really cares. We're never going to change it. Because the difference between Bubby having been born in Rzeszów and Bubby having been born in Oshvenshim is, to us, her children and grandchildren, who cannot properly pronounce or find on a map either city, negligible. And anyway, the errors are almost never discovered. The stories sit undisturbed and unprovoked, congeal into lore, no one is any the wiser. But what happens when the story is disturbed and provoked, when you seek to inspect or inhabit or engage with or build out parts of the story? Then the details do matter, especially the details you can touch and see and get up close to. Oshvenshim and Rzeszów are more than 200 kilometers apart. The difference between Machowskiego 12 and Machowskiego 34 is, when you're asserting your rights as an heir, immense. Once you enter the story, the where and the what matter, because those are your access points. Those are the story's anchors, the myth containers. And to get that wrong, to chase down the wrong building or go to the wrong city, is to get your story wrong, to misfire, to suffer that private but sharp humiliation of having cared in the wrong direction. Or maybe even then it doesn't matter. Maybe the relationship between our stories and the places they describe is more tenuous. Maybe it's just a phantom force, just us insisting there's something, pretending there's something, tricking ourselves into believing there's something. Earlier, I wrote how these sorts of stories can flex, can absorb, that they'll always have interesting and meaningful detours. But maybe that's not true. Maybe the detours, in fact, break the story a little, put into relief and reinforce the distance between you and whatever or whoever it is you think you're connecting with. Expose the fiction of sentimentalism, in other words. You thought this thing, this object, this building was meaningful, was special, but it turns out no, it's just an object, just another building. It means nothing to you. You were creating all that in your head. And if that feeling of meaningfulness could be so wrong and misplaced, then what is that feeling worth? What is that feeling at all? Or maybe the sentimental history isn't erased, but overwritten. Maybe it retains the narrative of having been meaningful. In Jewish law, when an object that is kadosh, holy, loses its holiness, like a Torah scroll that loses a couple of letters and thus becomes unusable, it does not then become spiritually meaningless, does not revert to a mundane object. Rather, it becomes an object that once was holy and must be treated accordingly. You cannot put it in the trash. You have to give it a proper burial. Thank you.
That's great. And I'll just say, Menachem, I thought you made a brilliant choice in choosing to write this as a memoir. It works really well. I really appreciated all of the self-reflection that you have and that your ambivalence. I thought it worked really well for this form. So as someone who also is super interested in my family history, and I've been to Poland and searched the cemetery in my grandparents' shtetl, so I could relate to a lot of it. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions now. So please put your questions in the chat box, or there's not that many people here. So if you want to unmute yourself, let me know and I'll unmute you. Well, in the meantime, I'll add other spotlights. Did you get back your property? That's for you, Menachem, I guess.
No, I mean, well, neither no nor yes. It's still ongoing. The day I submitted the final draft to the editor, we got word that sort of the next step was going to happen. Over Pesach, we had a trial, and so we're incrementally closer.
Okay. Karen, where can we purchase your book? And is there a Kindle?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to get if you're in Israel in particular, but it's available on Amazon and also through, there's no Kindle version, unfortunately. I'll post the SPD link to my book. It might be easier to get it through there. Thanks for asking.
Would you recommend doing it? I think that's another question for you, Menachem. Would you recommend
reclaiming property? I mean, from a financial perspective, probably not. I would say leave a good decade from start to finish. Give yourself a decade, and then it will be interesting. But I think it takes sort of. I didn't know what I was getting to when I started, so definitely you could contact me directly. And I could put you in touch with people who can help you out. Just to take stock of what it might entail, what it might be worth. But then there's also sort of the emotional journey, which is going to be very specific to you. And so that's a question I can't really answer.
Another question, Menachem, do you have documents of the property?
Yeah, so the most legally relevant document was a mortgage deed from it was a letter in the 60s that had a copy of a mortgage register from the 30s that affirmed my great-grandparents that owned the property. And so that was the most, I would say, legally relevant document we had. And then there's, in the court system, they sort of have a giant pre-war written records of who owned which building, and in there, but I didn't know that until we started the reclamation process, lists my great-grandparents as the owners.
Okay, so Lisa has two questions, but I'll start with the one from Meryl. Meryl, can you speak about the research you did and how long it took you to write your wonderful novel? Wait, you're on mute, wait.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for that. I would say that I have been researching this for my entire adult life. I was a history teacher. I'm very familiar with primary sources, and I read a lot. I have watched every film, every documentary, everything related to the Holocaust, and also have read books. I conducted interviews with survivors, children of survivors, and grandchildren of survivors, and I also relied on some very excellent books. I'm only going to name a few. There are many. Some of them are in the notes at the end of my book, but certainly Menachem Rosensack wrote a great book, Faith and Identity, God, Faith and Identity from the Ashes, where there are pieces by children of Holocaust survivors and grandchildren, and they talk about the impact on their lives. Certainly, Helen Epstein was interesting. One of the decisions I had to make was where my characters were going to come from, and I researched various places in Poland, and when we were in the Berkshires one summer, we went to a Jewish film festival there, and there was a film called Bogdan's Journey about the Kels pogrom, which is not well known. It was a pogrom that took place in Kels pogrom more than a year after the war was over in Europe, where 40 Jews were murdered by a mob of Polish civilians and soldiers and police officers, and more than 40 were injured. So I decided that would be a good place to have my characters come from, and there are people like Jan Gross who writes about that. So always, I'm still researching it, and I'm working on a sequel now. But in terms of the time to write the book, I would say that it was 3 years. I did really intensive research in the first 2 years, and I just couldn't get going with the writing. I would write something and I would trash it, but I kept doing the research. And then in the 3rd year, the stars all came together. I continued the research, but the characters and the story led me, and I wrote it in a year. Thank you.
Okay, so now we'll go to the question from Menachem from Lisa. Can you speak about the different receptions of Abraham Kaiser's story in Poland and in Israel? I felt the reclamation story opened up into an elegy for your family and enabled the readers to more clearly see some of the lost lives and their significance.
Thank you, Lisa. It's also good. Lisa and I were in a writer's workshop a few years ago in New York, and Lisa's novel, I believe she presented here not too long ago, and I recommend everyone please take a look. So yeah, Abraham, his memoir came out in Poland in the early 60s, but there was a Hebrew version. He basically took the manuscript before it was published to Israel when he emigrated in the late 40s, and it was published in Hebrew in the early 50s. And one of the sort of more interesting and richer parts of my research were sort of figuring out the difference between the two legacies of these books. And so they're very close to identical in terms of content, but they're not exactly identical. But even sort of more interesting is how differently they've been received. So in Israel, despite the fact that it's a historically significant Holocaust memoir, is from 1952, and it sort of it details concentration camps for which it's basically the primary document. It's more or less a forgotten text. So it's been out of print for 60 years. It's very difficult to find. It took me more than 2 years to track down a copy, and it's something that just sort of fell off the map. To contrast that in Poland, there it's a celebrated text, reprinted constantly, sold in gift shops, and it's read very, very differently, particularly by the treasure hunters who use it, as I write, sort of as the textual equivalent of a treasure map. And so, yeah, there's very, very different legacies. So one of the questions I sort of grapple with, like that, what's preferable, a sort of celebrated myth or the truth that's very quickly forgotten. And so, yeah, it's sort of a rich question.
Karen, I love the chapbook immensely, but because of the brevity of a chapbook, it left me wanting more. Do do you have anything else planned or hoping to be released? And I'm going to add a question of my own for you is, have you heard from any of the authors at all from of the original authors of Best 1998?
Well,
Of contacting
that
them? That's another question.
well, I'll start with the second part of the question. No, I haven't heard from anybody yet. I think I was terrified that I would. But the thing about a chapbook is it's kind of modest, hidden. It doesn't grab all that much attention. So I'm kind of happy with that aspect, and not being forced to face some of the people who I wrote about. I got into some very personal details of their lives, which were available on the internet, but still, it's creepy when somebody does that. And for Peter's question about if I'm working on anything, I found that I don't know if it's me. I just don't have the patience to write more than, a few hundred words at a time. So everything I've been working on is still these tiny little pieces that hopefully I can pull together into larger collections, or maybe eventually I'll be able to, have the staying power for something longer. But right now I'm working on, when I say working on, it's very, that's a generous word. But I'm working on a collection of stories about objects that I've given away on various websites and the people who claim them. And that's my current project. And I hope something comes out of it.
Okay, I see Ellen has a question, but before I want to let Asaf unmute himself. If you want to say, yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. This was really a wonderful evening for readings. I just want to comment that I was really touched by the issues of importance of detail, the frustration with the errors, and I thought that we're trying to connect certain reality of emotions and events and things that really happen in the house, or getting some paperwork or whatever, reaffirms it in some ways. And maybe we're then reminded it was important, maybe, so maybe it's something that is built into us, needing these things, even though they are in themselves maybe less holy. And actually the opposite, or maybe we're doing exactly the same thing when they were looking for a certificate of death for the grandparents who were 104 years old. They were trying to hold on to something, so to speak, unholy, very important that this person really existed and had this family and so on.
Well, they were trying to. They were trying to give you a hard time.
I know.
Okay, thank you. Meryl, did you ever teach Holocaust in Hebrew school, and at what age level? She used the book, The Number of My Grandfather's Arm, to introduce the 5- and 6-year-olds to the Holocaust.
No, I have never. I've actually never taught Hebrew school. I taught public school, and I did teach about the Holocaust to the extent that I could at the time, and then I became an administrator in public schools, and we brought in a number of programs. I mean, one that particularly comes to mind was a program with a Holocaust survivor and a young woman who was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, and they talked about hate and prejudice, and but no, I never taught Hebrew school, but I will say that as I said, I certainly researched everything carefully. And in the time period of the book, it was very unusual for there to be a discussion about the Holocaust in Hebrew school. However, a generation later, some of the kids really felt that they were oversaturated, that everything was was a lot about the Holocaust. So so it really has changed over time. Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions? I have another question. Well, so Karen, you talked about your current project, and Meryl, you said you're working on a sequel. So Menachem, what are you working on right now? If you're working on anything.
Yeah, I'm going back to, I finished a novel in grad school about Yiddish poets. So we're trying to return to that and some other long form projects that have been dormant for some time now.
Great. Do you all feel that your, this is a question for all three of you, has your writing changed because of the pandemic at all? Yeah, I'll take this.
I mean, I have two small kids, and I would say that the pandemic has not been very beneficial for my writing, but I think it changes your perspective somewhat. So I'm excited about now that things are getting back to normal a little bit, to see like what it looks like now, my writing.
I would not have been able to write during the pandemic, and so I sort of, the timing worked as well as it could have for me, because I basically had to do the edits during the pandemic, and if I was doing I don't know what I would do. I don't think I would have been able to do any sort of serious writing of new material.
Did you write a lot of it?
I have.
Go ahead, Meryl. Sorry.
No, go ahead, finish.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, I mean, did you do, for Menachem, did you do any of the writing while you were in Poland itself, or you did most of the writing when you were back in New York?
Some of them, there's a few chapters that are sort of a little bit different in tone. And so those chapters, particularly the one where I visit the concentration camps, is a little bit of a different style. And so that one was mostly written in Poland. But no, the writing was mostly back in the States.
Okay, Meryl, go ahead.
I'm not really proud of my answer, so I would say that for a good part of the pandemic, because my book came out in August, I was very busy with talking about the book, and I was Zooming about the book, and I spent an inordinate amount of time on Facebook. As you know, we started the Jews Love to Read Facebook group, and I would say that in the last 3 months, I've started writing again, and the best thing for me is to challenge myself to write 500 to 1,000 words a day. And I just try to, if I challenge myself to write a certain number of words, I find that I can do that. But I have to say that I was pretty undisciplined through most of the pandemic, or I would start writing and then I'd suddenly say, oh no, I want to write an op-ed piece about something. So I was not very disciplined. I'm trying to get more disciplined now.
So that brings up another question of mine for Menachem and Karen. What do you guys have any like tips and tricks to get yourself to like force yourself to be disciplined and to write? Is it the number of words, is it time of day, or what works for you?
Well, a friend of mine once said that you can do anything for an hour a day. And I found that when I follow that advice, then it really does work. Like, especially since I'm writing in such a short form, an hour a day really builds up, and eventually you have a body of work. Unfortunately, I don't always follow that advice, but that is really great advice, and I would suggest that everyone follow it.
Yeah, my thing is that like inspiration is just often not going to be there, and so much more important is the discipline. And so it's, to me, like a sort of an anchor in my schedule is going to be more important than writing when I'm inspired, which is never. So yeah, I haven't been doing this for a while now, but sort of when I was doing more intense writing, just X number of hours per day, same time every day, and no internet. Yeah, that's it.
That's good practice. If you can stick to it, no internet. Okay. Menachem, is your book coming out in Polish or any other languages?
Yeah. So it's come out already in Australia. Okay, I guess that's English. It's coming out in the Netherlands the end of early summer. In Germany should be next year. And then just last week, I received an offer from a Polish publisher, which was something I've been very keen on for some time. And then, so that's, yeah, those are the translations for now.
That's great. Congratulations. That's amazing. We're going to wrap up in a minute or two, but if anybody has any other last questions, speak up now or let me know if you want to be unmuted. Happy to unmute people. I'm going to put in the chat the link to the list of books of all the authors hosted by Literary Modiin. Before I lose everybody, I just want to make my PSA that if you read any of these books, or really any books that you like, please help out all of these authors by going onto Amazon or Goodreads or both, or wherever you buy books online, and write a review. It's really helpful. And there are other ways you can help people, help the authors that you like, inviting them to speak at book clubs, asking your library to carry a copy of the book, spreading the word on social media. As we were talking before everybody came in from the waiting room, and talking about there's so many hundreds of books, thousands of books that get published each year. So if you find the ones that you like, please help out the author by spreading the word. Okay. Anyone have anything last words? I am planning the next Literary Modiin event will be on Sunday, June 27th. So save the date. The details will be shared in the next couple days. But I want to thank Meryl and Menachem and Karen for being with us today, and all of you for being with us on the line. This was great. I really enjoyed listening to all three of you, and I hope everyone did as well. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day or great night. Anyway.